Good morning, afternoon or evening, depending on what time zone you're in. Welcome to this webinar that DDEX is holding around the two standards, the Digital Sales Report Standard and the Claim Detailed Message Standard. This is the first of two such webinars to introduce you to the two standards, particularly as the Claim Detail Message Standard was only announced a month or so ago. The agenda for today is obviously myself, Mark Isherwood, who is part of the DDEX Secretariat, will do a short sort of introduction. Then Laurent Lemasson from SACEM, who is one of the co-chairs of the working group that dealt with these two standards, will give an overview of the sort of data flow relating to the two standards. And my colleague Niels will give a description of the DSR and CDM standards. And then Laurent will talk about the process and some of the issues that we faced in actually developing the standards. And then we have three member organizations of DDEX, two who are licensors and one who is a licensee, who are going to talk about their experiences of implementation, particularly around the DSR standard and any indications of the thoughts relating to CDM, but mostly about DSR. Then we will show you how the two standards are closely integrated, and then there'll just be a short conclusion and Q&A. We are very happy to take questions via the chat as we go along, and we will monitor that as the webinar goes through. And please feel free to ask questions that way as we go along. So, as you know, DDEX is a standards development organization, and our aim is to ensure efficient communication of data up and down the music value chain. And we do that by standardizing three elements of that process. The first is the format of the messages, so the order in which data has to be created in a computer file and the relationships between those pieces of data. We then standardize the choreographies, which is the order in which the message is exchanged and what trigger points there might be upon receipt of a message, or a particular process begins and ends, and that might trigger a message being sent. And then finally, the message protocols by which those messages are actually exchanged. Most of that, up until relatively recently, the last year or two, has been through secure FTP sites, but increasingly elements of the business are moving towards web services to communicate the messages and to run their choreographies, which obviously creates more automation. DDEX has 8 families of standards which are sort of represented on this diagram. You will see various different types of companies that make up the industry, and the different lines will indicate the types of messages that they would normally be exchanging, given the particular business transactions that they wish to undertake. The two we're focusing on out of that diagram today, as I've said, are the Digital Sales Report Standards and the Claim Detail Message Standards. These are primarily around the licensing or the process of royalty payments around musical works, but the standard also deals with the reporting of sales and usage in relation to sound recordings. But obviously the focus at the moment is mostly in relation to sales and usage reporting around musical works. DDEX's mission, I've already really talked about the first couple of bullets there, but there are other elements that we work on, particularly around identification, unique identification systems, particularly with other standards organizations in the industry, IFPI in respect of the ISRC and CSAC in respect of the ISWC, and with other industries like IDA, which is a film industry standard identifier. And all of these are and can be included in any DDEX message. And you'll see that as we go through some of the detail. We will, if necessary, develop our own unique identification systems where none exists and we feel there is a need for one. But that area of work is very much a collaborative effort with other standards organizations. And likewise, seeking to improve metadata quality and consistency is something that we do a lot with other organizations in an attempt to put in best practice around the way in which metadata is created and managed, so that we're improving or hoping to improve the whole ecosystem as we go along. Two final points. Firstly, DDEX is pretty ubiquitous. We know that 5,500 companies have taken out implementation licenses. DDEX itself doesn't have information on who has actually done implementation, so we don't have formal data of that nature. But we do know that, you know, any serious company in the music industry on a global basis is using one or other of the DDEX standards to help manage their business. And one last thought of a general nature. The thing that underpins DDEX's standards is its data dictionary. It is the lingua franca of the music industry now. If you don't talk DDEX, for want of a better phrase, you're going to struggle to communicate with your business partners. So the data dictionary is a very fundamental part of our work. It contains all the semantics of the terms and the structure of some of the major composites within the messages. So that's a brief introduction to DDEX. We'll now get into the detail of what we want to talk to you about. So I'm going to hand over now to Laurent, who will talk about the sort of conceptual part of DSR and CDM. So Laurent.
Hi everyone. So yes, I will introduce the DSR, the standards, the sales reports, and also their choreography. So first things, there are two sets of standards. The first one is DSR. It's to send sales usages and also revenues from the licensees to the licensors. And the second one is for the licensors to send back to the licensees the claims they have on the works of their repertoires they have identified in the different releases that have been sent in these sales reports. Next slide. So the principle is that the DSP sent to the rights controller, so the sales report message, as I said just before, and just after, thanks Mark, then the rights controller sent back to the DSP using the CDM message, the claim and detail message, the claims and the invoice details for the work he has claimed. In terms of formats, so originally there were an XML format. from the DSP to the rights controller that has been phased out. And now there is a flat file that we name DSRF. And on the other way, from the rights controller to the DSP, there is so CDM. That is one. That is also one flat file.
Laurent, can you go on back, Mark? Because there's one issue here. Why did we phase out the XML and worked on the DSRF? Can you go a little bit more into some details there, Laurent?
Sure. Why? It's because the first point is that after I don't know how many years of very good services of XML, we licensors and licensees were facing some difficulties. The first one was about volume of reporting. At that time, the market was growing very fast, and we were seeing the volume growing exponentially. So this was really an issue, especially because with XML, it was about 80% of the volume was for the tags, and 20% then for the data in itself. So we had really to do something on that. The second point was also, which is a consequence. Let's say it pushed some incurring running costs. It was incurring running costs. And a third point also is that especially for the smaller players, the complexity of XML linked with the size of the message, but also the complexity of XML in itself was an obstacle to adopting the solution. So in few words, this was, I think, the three key points.
That seems to be the key points from the music rights societies and publishers' point of view. How does that look out from the DSP side, from the licensee side?
Yeah, hey Niels. This is Daniel Prosser. I work for Spotify in Singapore. And I think I would echo what Laurent said, that fundamentally the two reasons were the sheer size of the XML files were hard to manage. You know, as he said, the nature of the XML is that you have everything encapsulated in these repeating opening and closing tags, nested themselves within further repeating groups of repeating tags. And so some of these files just became enormous. And I think, frankly, that was more of a problem for the licensors, but even for us, it's something that obviously we want to reduce the size of these files, and the community wanted a more human readable format, and the flat file enables you to have that by removing these repeating fields, these nested XML structures, and including these summary records that tell you, for this product we had this many streams, we had this much total revenue, and so I would say that that's I would say largely an issue that we felt indirectly, in the sense that it was a barrier for licensors, and so Spotify see that as delaying the process of them processing our usage reports and sending us back claim files. But then, of course, there were also marginal benefits on our side, because it saves us storage costs for one thing and processing time.
So that's one of the main objectives then on DSRF, or DSR as we call it these days, making them smaller. Are there any other design objectives that we had when we developed it?
I wanted just to mention one thing in terms of just about the difficulties we were talking about, that also on licensor side, we had also another difficulties that was in fact related to the structure and to the split between the work data and the sales data. Because you remember in XML, you had all this work data first, and then at the end, you had the sales data related to this work data. So it was a globalization in terms of volume, which was good, but especially on licensor side, there was an issue there, is because all licensors had first to ingest this data in order for claiming and computing the data, you need both information. You need the work data and you need the sales data at the same time. So they had first to know the data and then reprocess it to calculate the claims.
Okay.
Answering to your question about main objectives, on licensor side, the objectives were almost the same. In fact, we have to ensure that all licensors can process the files for the for the licensees because of these volumes and complexity. In case of the licensors, the problems were amplified due to the fact that we received the sales reports from all the licensees. So each licensor had to manage a full volume from all licensees worldwide for some licensors. So the key objective was to find a quick and pragmatic solution. Another key objective was also to have some, let's say, to develop a standard that can also embrace the complexity of the various business models. All the new business models that pop up during the last years, so which was so a key point on that. And maybe, yeah, one last point. We had, and this is correlated, of course, we had in mind to reduce also the setup costs for the development part, but also for the test part. By creating also objects that can be reused from one profile, we will explain that later, but from one profile to another.
Thank you very much. I hope that answers those questions.
Yes, now the choreography. So 2 columns, licensee, licensor. So the first step is that there is the sales report that is sent by the licensee to the licensor using the DSR standard. It can be an acknowledged file, which is a technical file that is a standard, a DDEX standard that is true for all DDEX standards, not only DSR. Then after that, the licensor match its the works with its repertoire and send back the CDM to the licensee with the claims, the detailed invoice, and then after that, if there are some discrepancies, then the licensee can generate some CDM discrepancies. It can be some technical discrepancies, like, I don't know, an issue in the format. It can be also a problem of tariff, for instance. Okay, you used the wrong tariff. And there is also, so for that, the licensee, sorry, use what we name CDM record discrepancies. And there is also another standard which is named DSR overclaim discrepancies that enables the licensee to report to licensors with S when there are overclaims between the different works that have been claimed. And then, of course, it is sent to all different licensors following a bilateral agreement when this is decided to be used. Yeah, one very important point is that we have 2 standards but one architecture. And this is one key point because it's, as you have all understood, CDM is the answer to DSR. So it was very important that it used the same architecture, it used the same allowed value sets. In general, it used all the same objects. So CDM can precisely reference an individual claim or invoice detail record. So it's done to work together.
Thanks, Laurent, for that introduction, and to show that the DSR and CDM work together in such a way that you have a complete message flow that allows the royalties to flow as well. A lot of what I'm about to say you will hear several times during our presentation today, but that's because I'm just summarizing the main business benefits to the adoption of DSR and CDM. It's obviously a worldwide industry standard. DSR has already been very widely adopted. The two standards are quite cheap to implement and maintain, certainly as against the XML version of DSR. And that is true for both senders and receivers in terms of it being simple to administer, and the volumes certainly in respect of the DSR are up to 100 times smaller than they would be if you were using the XML version. Niels will talk more about this in a moment, but the DSR and CDMs are structured flat files, which makes it much easier to ingest and start processing on your systems. And this is because the data about the resources, releases, resources, and works, and the sales lines are in self-contained blocks, and you'll hear more about that in a moment. That can be processed independently from one another, and the same applies to the CDM. The standards are very flexible in so much as you can report multiple business models in one report, and also the way in which the standards are developed allows changes to be made quite easily to deal with new business models. One other point is that the XML version of DSR and the CCID, which is not a DDEX standard, but one that's used in Europe as a claimed message, was very download centric, and clearly we now have a multiple business models other than downloads. And so the way we've developed the DSR and the CDM is to accommodate all business models with more functionality and greater flexibility of reporting. And we also provide a complete choreography, and that enables partners to know exactly which order they need to exchange messages. And one of the major goals in terms of CDM in particular was the ability to provide more transparency, traceability, and auditability around the actual invoicing process. And that again is a major benefit. So I'm now going to pass on to my colleague Niels, who will take a deeper dive into DSR and to a lesser extent CDM. The deep dive on CDM will be in the webinars next week.
Thank you very much, Mark. So let's talk about DSR and CDM. And as Laurent and Mark have already indicated, both standards actually join the technical fundamental setup. The technical basics are the same for both of those formats. They're both tabular separated value files. They are CSV files basically, where the tabulator is the delimiter between the cells. That enables you to just load those files into a spreadsheet application. assuming that the file is small enough. If you have a report with too many lines, then of course Excel or other tools will fail. But in principle, for smaller reports, you can simply ingest it into a spreadsheet. But it's not a very, very simple spreadsheet, because the requirements for reporting sales usages and providing claims and invoice details is too complex. For example, we need to have the ability to provide multiple writers for a musical work. And while you can, of course, allow multiple cells for that, multiple columns, that is, for each of the writers, that would need us to predetermine how many writers you can communicate. And that's not feasible. So we have things like secondary delimiters, which allows you to say, for example, that Lennon and McCartney, both of those gentlemen, were writer of a specific song. We use the pipe character to separate those. You can even include a pipe character or even a tab character in a band name if somebody is mad enough to use those things. We certainly are also or meet the requirements to communicate not just Latin characters, but also Asian characters, 2, 4, or 8 even bit characters, if that is necessary, byte characters. So we use UTF as the format. But more than these little fundamental things, those reports, the sales report and the claim detail messages, they are structured flat file. And by that we mean we have different record types. In the DSR, we have one record or a number of record types that describe the releases, the albums that are being traded. We have a record type that describes the resources. We have records that describe the musical works that are part of those resources that are part of a release. We have records that provide sales and usage information in the DSR standard. In the CDM format, we then, on the other hand, have information about claims and about invoice information, not surprisingly. And then both formats have summary information, and they have header and footer information to contain basically information like who sends the message to whom, what is the date the file was generated, and so forth. So it's a fairly straightforward setup, but it's not just a simple format where one column always means exactly the same thing. So if we're looking at the next slide, as I said, we have different record types, the headers and the footers, the summary records, and then the release usage records and the sales usage records. Quite critically is that you need to be able to point from one of those records to another record. So in this diagram on the right-hand side, you see, for example, a number of summary records. Those summary records, for example, provide you all the information for the downloads that happen in, let's say, Sweden. And the next summary record may be the downloads that happen in Norway, and the third one may be the downloads that happen in Denmark. And the blocks and the sales and usage information in those blocks will then provide additional information or the detailed information for one of those individual summary records. So all the sales and usage information for Norway in block 1 will point to the summary record 1, or the Norwegian sales and usage will point to the summary record number 2, and so forth. So there's an easy way to point from one bit of the report to the other. But the crucial bit is all the information that belongs together is in one of those blocks. Traditionally, the reports cover only one territory and one currency and one commercial model, one use type and one service type. So it's only, well, let's stay with Norway. So it's only Norway in Norwegian kroners for, let's say, pay-as-you-go model. It's a download, and service type, it's the different tiers that DSPs offer. This together we call a sales context, and traditionally sales reports only covered one sales context. But that's not that efficient. So just looking at the 3 Scandinavian countries that I've mentioned, well, the releases and the resources that were used in those territories would in all likelihood be the same. Wouldn't it be more efficient if we just had describing those releases, those resources, those musical works, and then have different sales lines for the different territories? Well, that's what we call a multi-sales context report, and the DSR format allows for it as long as both parties agree that they would want to do those things. So single and multi-context reports are supported by the standard. So let's have a look at one of those reports, and while you can't see this, we can blow it up a little bit. The color mind is just for your benefit here today. Clearly, a TSV file does not contain any color. It's black and white, but it's much easier to look at this. And while this looks rather daunting when you look at it at first, it's actually not that bad. Let's have a look at the individual portions there. At the top, in this case, it's all written in boldface. Again, that's more for presentation than anything else. That's just comments. The first characters you will note is the hash or pound symbol, however you want to call it, that indicates in the format that it's a comment and is not to be taken as real data. That just contains the header or the cell types of every name, of every cell. So you have a header cell, which starts always with the word head. You have the footer, which always starts with foot, and then you have the summary lines. They always start with SY and then a number. Release records, RE and a number. The sound recording and musical work records, they start with AS and a number. And the sales and usage records, they start with an SU. There are a couple of other records, but that's not important at this stage. And of course, there is much more to the right because we just can't see that. But here we have the header, for example. And you see in the very first line, it's version 3.0 of the file. That's the second cell. It's a basic audio profile in version 1.1. It was sent by the message number. Each message has a unique number. It's message CTO 201601152, and it was created on the 25th of January 2016 at 9:18:22 local time. And there are a couple of more fields to the right that we don't really need to worry too much about. They're dealing with who sends it to whom, when it was being created, and so forth. The next bit on this file is the summary record. That provides you with the sales context in which a certain amount of sales usage has occurred. In this case, it is done by test company 1. It's a pay-as-you-go model of a permanent download in France. And all the sales usage information that provide pay-as-you-go permanent downloads in France would then summarize to this summary records. And in this case, we only have one of those blocks that I've talked about earlier, and that's all the red, green, and light blue information shown here. The release that was sold or distributed, or whatever the business model may be, well, permanent download in this case, is in dark blue. Then there are 14 tracks, 15 sound recordings on that album. That includes works information. Then there are in light blue 6 sales and usage records, and then there are 3 what we call sub-releases. Sub-releases are those contexts for, or they're the concept of complete my album. If a consumer has already bought a number of singles and now they want to buy the album on which those singles were part, some DSPs then offer them basically a discount that they don't need to rebuy those tracks again. And that can be modeled using those sub-releases. That these all belong to the same block, and what's currently highlighted is the block number, in this case number 1. The next block would typically just be number 2, number 3, number 4, and so forth. This tells the recipient that the releases and the resources belong together, so that all the AS records describe sound recordings that are on release, that the release in the first line that is being highlighted. Can you go one further? And the pointing between those records is shown at the moment. At the bottom, for example, you see that the sales usage, the first sales usage line, points to the release number 1. That is the very first dark green one. The 3 lines further down, there is a sales usage line that points to release number 17. Well, that's the first of the green sub-releases. And then there's one for 18, and there's one for 19. And then there are some that point to directly a resource. That's the second of the sales usage line that points to the second resource, which is the Festive Overture, and the next one points to the number 4, which is the Gradfly Opus 97, the first of the 2. So this is how the files are actually structured and how you can navigate them. And last but not least, you here have the pointer from the sales usage records to the summary record that I showed you earlier. So that indicates that all of these sales usage information is about pay-as-you-go downloads in France. We don't need to repeat that information again and again and again and again. It is simply represented by one character, the number 1 here.
Niels.
So that is, yeah, I see the question, just a second. So that is how the format is basically structured. So the question is, if you get a record which contains, in this case, an ASO 2.01 record, which, by the way, is the second of the sound recording records that we have developed, ASO 2, and it's the first version, or the first updated version of that. The question basically is, what happens if the description of the record types with a hash doesn't agree with the actual data? The actual data counts. Whatever is in the hash lines, which is currently grayed out at the top, that is purely for human convenience, so that if a human looks at it, they can see that cell, I don't know, 55F is an ISRC or whatever it may be, I don't know. But the data in the real lines, that's what counts.
Yes, exactly. Just one word on that. We used hash, as you know, in many development tools, languages. Hash is used for the comments. So it's just a comment just to help the human reading.
Good. And I've already talked about the AS bit. Yes. So we have a number of profiles. 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I counted yesterday. I can't remember already. So we have 7 different profiles. One of those is for the reporting to record companies. All other profiles are for the reporting of sales and usages to works licensors, music rights societies, and or music publishers or their agents. One of the questions that has come up, and maybe Laurent, you can talk to that, is why we have decided to go for different profiles rather than the, well, arguably simpler setup of having one profile that covers everything. In the end, it's sales usage about musical works, isn't it?
Yes and no. First, it's a usage about music, but it can be also audiovisual. That's why you have, for instance, the audiovisual profile, so different types of works. But it has also, it's a worldwide standard, so it has to cope with all different business models. And when there are, let's say, too many specificities, a specific business model, then we created what we named profiles. Typically what we did for UGC, what we did also for royalty reporting, for instance. It's interesting. This standard is used, as I know, it's used in North America, maybe in other territories, but it is not used in Europe, as I know. So you have also, what my point is that you have also some regional, let's say, specificities. So yes, for all these reasons, we use these different profiles. But bearing in mind that the key point is to keep the same objects in order to save money in terms of setup costs and maintenance costs also. So all these different profiles use as much as possible. They reuse the same records. They reuse the same records. So it is a compromise we found to save costs and to have something worldwide taking in account all these different specificities.
Thank you. Is there anything to add from the licensee's point of view, or did Laurent cover that?
Well, I think from like Spotify point of view, I can talk that indeed the basic audio is tackling our streaming business model, whereas the UGC would be used in the YouTube business model, for example. So you have sound recordings embedded within videos, which we do not need for Spotify. So where there's only like a single official master recording. So that's just an example, but Laurent said it all.
Okay, good. Thank you very much, both. So yeah, those are the profiles. Some of those exist in what's called a single record block variant, and I'll come to that in a moment, whereas others do not at this stage. But as you can see, it's quite a lot of bits and pieces that are being covered by this. I'm going to present a little bit more detail about one of those profiles, and I've just basic audio just because it's the first in the line here, not because it's in any way special. But before I go there, there is this difference between the single record block variants and the multi-record block variants. Each block comprises of a single block record in the single record block variant. So a block, as I said or shown earlier, contains all the information about the release that has been used, the resource that has been used, the musical work that is part of that resource, that is part of that release, and then the sales and usage information. All of that can be put into one very long line. That's what the single record block variant does. The multi-record block variant, on the other hand, splits those bits into separate lines. And what I've shown you in the example earlier is the multi-record block variant. The benefit of that is it's much more compact because you don't need to repeat everything. If you have a 10-track album and you use each track 10 different times, then in a single record block record, you would need to repeat the album description 100 times. In the multi-record block variant, you'd have it once, and underneath there you have all the different resources, and underneath there you would have all the different usage of it. So single record block variants are bigger, but they're also much less hard to implement because you don't need to deal with different record types. So they're geared towards those companies that are less able to working with those more complex files. Fortunately, those are also those companies which are in all likelihood have smaller catalogs. Therefore, their reports are not as big. So the penalty in payment in file size is less of an issue. That's why for some of the profiles we've provided those two different variants. We have these different profiles, and each of the profiles is basically a standard on its own. They're all based on a couple of general parts that apply to all the standards, the general architecture that defines all the delimiters and the file naming convention, all of those aspects. We have one part that deals with all the allowed values or code lists, so they define what different use types there are, what different commercial model types there are, and so forth. And then we have one common part that defines all the structure of all those record types. And then the profiles put those record types and those allowed values together with the general architecture and saying, well, this is how you do basic audio, this is how you do UGC, this is how you do financial reporting to record companies. That allows us also to advance, for example, just the UGC profile, but we don't need to advance the basic audio profile at the same time. We can, if there's a good reason for it, but we can move them at different speeds depending on changed business requirements. But now I think we're getting to looking at the basic audio profile. And as Magali has said, it's for albums and singles and music videos, but it's for streaming and it's for download models. And the structure there is really that you have in the fundamental case, you have a head release. That's the album that you can download from your downloads store, or that's the, if you like, mini playlist that you get on a streaming service where you stream an album. It's that little album subpage that you get, and from which you then stream the individual resources. The individual resources here shown in red or in magenta, some of which include work information. The first three in this case already include work information. The fourth resource, the fourth sound recording, does not have any work information directly because maybe it's based on two different musical works, and therefore that needs to be communicated separately. What's missing on that diagram is a little arrow from the musical work to the resource number 4. That's just has been forgotten on this diagram. And then at the very bottom, the green one I'll come to in a second, at the very bottom, you then have the sales and usage. The very last one is sales and usage information for the head release, where somebody bought the entire album. And then the other two lines, they are sub-releases. So the first of the sub-releases only comprises resource 2 and 4, and the second of the sub-release only comprises resource 1. So if somebody just streams that release from that album, then the sales line would just point to that sub-release, which in turn then points to the resource, which then tells the licensor which work has actually been used. In some cases, the DSP doesn't have release data, and then you don't need to provide it. Well, if they don't have it, they can't, but it's still valid. So you can simply have a resource and sales usage information for it, or a resource with then musical works separated out. And because there is no release there, you can have only one sound recording for each of the blocks. Each block is then one sound recording plus a number of works, or none if it's part of the resource record, plus a number of sales usage records. Fairly straightforward. And we have basically two types of sales usage records, one for download and one for streaming, because the numbers are similar yet slightly different, so they need to be catered for. CDM, as we've said several times, is very similar. We have a general architecture, which is the same architecture as DSR. The file naming convention is slightly different, but otherwise it's virtually the same. You have a number of profiles, and you have a document that defines the allowed values. And what's not on this diagram is one part that actually defines the record type. That also exists. That's actually part 2, funnily enough. And in this case, the profiles are one for the CDM itself, the claim and detail messages, one for those record discrepancies that Laurent mentioned, and one that deals with overclaim discrepancies. That, I believe, is all I had for now. Again, a reminder, if you have any questions, please do mention them on the chat and we'll try to answer them. Laurent, back to you.
So process of developing DSR. So first we started with an excellent basis because first we had this experience, roughly 8 years experience with XML, with the XML format. So we reused, of course, the fields that have been used in the XML formats. We had, because of this experience, also a good analysis of the weaknesses, and also a good view about the new business requirements, because as you all know, it's a very dynamic market, and it's evolving rapidly, changing rapidly. So one word about the development process. It runs, I think, as in all other DDEX groups. So there are proposals from the members. So on the structure, there is an amalgamation of these into a commonly acceptable structure, and an iterative process to refine records on profiles. So we have this regular DDEX DSR working groups to design and to improve the standards. So the working groups set requirements, review the proposed solutions, and we have this very regular conference calls, especially at that time, and we share documents online. Usually, except of this specific period, we have 2 plenary meetings per year, that with rotating between 3 places: East Coast of North America, West Coast of America, and Europe. And we have also reviews of the regular reviews of our working group progress, and recommendations on to the board on work items. And we have also regional and depending on different topics, regional meetings. And yes, all of DDEX work is done by consensus. This is a key point. I would say that as a DDEX DSR co-chair, there is I think an excellent collaboration between all the different actors. Of course, it's not always easy, because you have different business needs, different interests. But I've always seen a very good spirit and very positive results, and I would like to thank you very much, the group, for this great collaboration spirit, because of course it is why we succeeded in the setup of the standard, and in the design, and now in the setup.
So Laurent, what were then those difficult issues that you had to resolve? Well, and apparently did resolve, and how?
I would say it's not it's a list of different discussions, because of this what I just said, because of these different business needs. So we take the time. It takes time also, and to listen each other, to understand what are the different needs, and find a good compromise that match everybody needs. If I answer to your question. Do you want me to present the standard development process also, Niels, or is it up to me also, or is it?
I can view, I don't know.
Okay, I can. So in terms of, so the process is, of course, there is a standard process for this. First thing, you have, of course, to be a DDEX member, and you make a request for change. Then the board assigns the work to the working group. Then the working group works on an iterative process, and once we get a standard with all the different needs, we declare what we named a committee draft. Then the members review it and provide comments. They have 1 month to do that. And at the end, there is a DDEX group that is in charge of supervision of what the other groups do, and consistency between all the different groups, which is a technical management group. Then this group review this on the different comments, and then after that, once this the TMG has also validated it, then there is the board will ratify the standard, and then the DDEX Secretariat will publish the new standard, and then it becomes a public standard. And yes, one point you highlight, Niels, here is that typically there is one standard per year because we were conscious that there are, let's say, mini work to do these different adaptations. So we try to publish not more than one per year standard.
Thanks very much, Laurent, for that. As I indicated, we are joined by a number of DDEX members here who have very kindly offered to give you an indication of their implementation experiences around the DSR standard. So we are joined by Jakue, Lopez, and Laurent again with Armonia, the Armonia hats on, and David Butler from iServices, and then Magali Clapier and Zoe Griffith from Spotify, and Chris Bly from Apple. And they're now going to talk about their experiences, which will hopefully give you a little bit more insight into the challenges that you may face if you start to implement any of these standards. So first of all, over to Laurent and Jakue.
Maybe just one word before we talk about the Armonia back office. That Armonia is a group of licensors in Europe, and we that license and also process the files with our partner BIMAT, and I will let Jakue, that is at the head of this online part in BIMAT, to share our Armonia experience on that. Thank you, Jakue.
Thanks, Laurent. Can you hear me properly?
Yeah.
Yes.
Fine.
Super. Thank you. So I'll start going through some of the main advantages that the DDEX DSR flat file has over the XML counterpart. Mark has already highlighted some of those, but from a purely cost-efficient perspective, we've seen that the implementation effort of XML of the flat file compared to XML has reduced. So it is a simpler but still complete specification, and the main difference is that it is flat, as its name explains, which means that it can be read linearly, still with a structured hierarchical schema, but it can be read linearly. This means that the memory footprint while processing these reports is negligible. There is no need to reference parts of the report within itself, with the exception of the summary reports, which makes the process cheaper. We can use cheaper servers with less RAM memory, as there is no need of storing such huge amounts of data in memory in order to process, which is the case for XML reports. In terms of processing time, we've seen a reduction between 5 and 10 times, depending on the profile. For that exact same reason, the reports are self-contained and it can be highly parallelized. So it's a process that is much more efficient to carry on from the ingestion perspective. And in terms of validation, although we rely on custom validation processes, there are validators available in DDEX GitHub similar to the XSD for XML. There's already one for the flat file as well, with similar behavior. In terms of format highlights, there is still that release sub-release reporting capability. So within a single block, it is possible to combine different resources to report different usages of or different usage combinations. No, so different same tracks with different prices being sold or streamed. So that reduces significantly the amount of data that needs to be put in the report. One of the main advantages also is that it contains single resource blocks. What does this mean? It means that when XML was created a few years back ago, it was originally designed to work for download services like iTunes at the time, mostly. And XML has been adapted for the use of streaming services, but it was not designed for that. And in an environment where most of the elements transacted are singles and not the concept of an album is a bit more blurry in the streaming business context, it created some dummy data generation that was not very efficient. So this is something that, thanks to the newly defined architecture, is being simplified. And also that it is the first standard that it allows to allocate metadata that is specific to user-generated content DSPs. Any report prior to the UGC profile of the DDEX DSR flat file was custom reports from the different UGC DSPs. But this is the first attempt to, which is already in use, and it will be used more in the coming year with the popularity of more UGC DSPs. So it is important that this is something that has been discussed widely in the context of the working group, and a number of actors have agreed. Yeah, I'm not going to go too much into detail on this. Is pretty much what I explained. I think we can leave this for the deep dive next week. So you can skip this, Mark, please. Yeah, and Jan, this is the last two slides I have are a bit of to give a bit of a sense to those of you who are listening on how widely used these standards are. So there are already 15 DSPs using it in production. The first one we integrated was in early 2016. We have a 6-year experience on processing files, and the first 2 years were custom formats and XML reports, but since 2016, we already saw some of the first DSPs implemented in the early versions of the standard. And it also, I wanted also to highlight, like, once that implementation is done, there have been updates, and the effort on our end to be able to handle those updates has been quite smooth. Partly is because of the architecture design that is split into profiles and the way that it is thought from the ground of having different records and to just have to update certain records and certain profiles as opposed to a whole set of a standard. So, for example, a latest update that we did from switching one profile from 1.0 to 1.2 took just 1 calendar quarter. And it was a small transition for our partners so that we could ensure that the delivery SLAs were met, so that distribution calendars were still up and back. And next one, please. And this is just, it's an image that I thought it was illustrative. It's just counting the number of usage files or the number of DSRs of flat file versus XML formats that we've received over time. You will see the first column is for 2015, so there's no flat file there. In 2016, we started to get the first ones, and you'll see how for 2019, which is the top right column. Almost half of the files that in number that we are getting are of the nature of DDEX DSR flat file. This year, I believe in number it has already exceeded, and the projections are that by the end of the year we will have as many flat files as XML files, which is a trend that it will keep changing for 2021 and early 2022, when some major DSPs will adapt to the flat files.
Thank you.
Thank
you, Jakue.
You can reach me. Thanks, Mark. If anyone has any question, feel free to reach me out, please.
So we'll now move to Spotify, and I believe Zoe is going to talk about their experiences.
Yeah, hi. So I'm Zoe. I work for Spotify in Stockholm. So Spotify are actually in the middle of our DSRF implementation. We're not yet sending DSRF reports in production, but we're hopefully close. And so this is a bit of an overview of the approach we've taken for rollout so far. So on the top half of the slide, we started by testing our understanding of the format with a small group of licensors, so people who are active in the working group who are already processing DSRF files from other DSPs. So we iterated a couple of times through, fixed some bugs, shared some test files, and now we're hopefully close to an implementation that works for everybody in that group. So after that, we're going to go into parallel run, where we will keep sending the usage files that we do today, and then we'll also send the DSRF files in parallel, just to iron out any final issues before we switch over. So for any new licensor who moves on to DSRF with Spotify, it would be a similar process. We'll share a sample file along with an implementation guide, then we'd share some full-size files specific to the licensor, and then we'd head into parallel run. But like throughout all of that, we've had open communication for any feedback or questions. So that's kind of how we're approaching it. On the business benefits, a few people have already spoken to some of the more technical benefits. We agree with all of those, especially around the file size and then the associated speed and cost of processing those large XML files. The DSR is much better for us. But then for us, we report to like many licensors in many markets. So just having a standard makes our lives easier in terms of having one format we can send to many people. And as Magali said earlier, just the way the files are structured, it's easier for a non-technical person to read them if needed. Okay, next slide. So we are using the basic audio profile, version 1.2, and the multi-record block version. I've listed out the records we're using, but I think it's easier if we go on to the next slide. So we've kind of got two types of implementation, what we've been calling single context, which Niels talked to a bit earlier, and then what we're calling market context, which I'll come to. It's a type of multi-context. So this slide is for single context. So you'll see there is only one summary record in the file. So it's like one service, in this case premium, one territory, France, 1 month, November 19 in this example. And then we've grouped our releases and resources and usage into a block. So a release is typically an album or a single on Spotify. A resource is what's streamed on Spotify, so it's typically equates to a track. And then the usage record points to a resource. So it's saying that this track was streamed, this resource was streamed, and it also points to the summary record. So this track was streamed on Premium. Okay, next slide. And then we're also doing what we call market context. We're calling it market, not multi-context internally, because there's been a preference from our licensors that we have one file per market. Of course, we could have many markets in one file, but the request so far has been to have one market per file to kind of control file size to a degree. So in this case, there's 2 summary records. There could be many more for a given territory. So one for premium, one for free. And then the usage record points to a track, a resource, in the DDEX standard in the context of a summary record. So this saves us on having to send that, like the information for the release and the resource many times across many files if we go for this sort of implementation. Okay. Yeah, we just had a couple of observations about our implementation so far. Like we didn't have many technical challenges going through it, but one issue that did come up was how do you escape delimiters within cells? So what happens if somebody has sent to Spotify a track title that has a tab in it? What's the correct way to escape that? And the standard tells you how we should do it. So we're compliant with the standard and we've worked through that issue. The other thing that worked well is we've tried to be transparent around sharing any issues that have been raised by licensors as they're testing the test files we've sent out, and being transparent about how we've chosen to fix them, because there is sometimes flexibility in how you fix an issue. Cool. That was it for me. Any questions? Let me know.
Thank you very much, Zoe. And now turning back to a licensor again, David will talk about ICE services experiences.
Okay, hi everyone. So about ICE services, so as well as being a processing hub for major publishers, ICE are a licensor in their own right for our parent companies, PRS, Stim and Gamer, so the UK, Swedish and German societies. So the first benefit really at very basic level would be decommissioning the legacy formats from the parent companies. That's pretty much there. I think there's a few stragglers, usually transitioning to DDEX. It happens at contractual change. So when someone's signing a new contract, we raise that. DSR itself, compared to XML, has all the benefits that people have covered already. So file sizes, processing time. There's less room for interpretation compared to XML, and it's relatively easy to version records. I think from our experience, if someone in the DDEX family wants a field and we don't need it, it's relatively easy to ignore it. Likewise, I don't know how new business models would cope if we were still in an XML world. I'm not an XML expert, but it seems to be relatively easy. There's a few head-scratching meetings that how things will work, but everything's been solvable so far. We currently process about 12 DSPs who have reported in the flat file. About 3 major DSPs we know are planning to move. And it's become our standard sort of welcome pack or a starter pack that we send out to new DSPs. There's a few we're dealing with sending us test files. That was the version 1.2 is the one we send out at the moment. We will be replacing that with 1.3 at some point. And we usually find that DSPs, even the smaller DSPs, once they get their head around it and see some sample files, they realize it's not as complicated as they thought. And those who ask to send an Excel spreadsheet or something like that can usually handle the DSR, even the multi-block variant. CDM, I suppose the benefits for us, so to move away from CCID to CDM, the benefits will come with multi-context. So to receive multi-context sales reports and send back a multi-context detailed invoice reduces the overall data sizes quite a bit. Again, we're working towards that. We haven't implemented CDM yet. As I put here, we thought our original plan is some point Q1 next year, but that's subject to review. So it's been through a kind of design stage. IT are aware of it, and we're just kind of moving towards development now. Back at the benefits, we're talking about so the choreography between disputes over claims. That puts consistency around that process, which is good. But that's a future phase for us. Handling corrections, disputes, it's part of a wider process we'll look at some point in the medium term. There are a few, I just put things here like there's a few system changes we need to to look at, nothing show-stopping. What's the source of your exchange rate? We don't have that in a table that can be exported into a file straight away, but it's a relatively easy change we need to factor in Q1 or next year. And we also need to look at timelines. I mean, literally migration. If a DSP wants all licensors to move to CDM, then we kind of need to sort of choreograph that, probably via Tauji. And then from my specific point of view, there's a lot of flexibility for customers. We have to weigh that up with having so many flavors in there that we kind of get overawed with what information we put in, because there's more information can be supplied in the CDM, which is good. I mean, transparency is good and flexibility is good, but we just have to balance that with what we can do. A standardized flavor would be good for us. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And last but not least, Chris from Apple will talk about their experiences.
Yeah, so just to give a quick introduction, I'm Chris. I work on the music publishing operations team at Apple and oversee our external usage reporting to our partners. So, from our implementation experience, the good things, partners like standards. We find a lot of times that, people don't like formatting, reporting formats being shoved down their throat and being like, hey, you have to take this. And we find a lot of partners that we work with actually kind of like to take DDEX because it is a standard that everyone can be a part of. So if you're not a member yet, I suggest looking into joining, and it's a lot of fun over here. In comparison to XML, the DSRF is much easier for testing. Apple launched iTunes back in 2001, and we still to this day actually use XML for our download reporting, which it's challenging to go and figure out issues that pop up in reporting because of the XML structure and needing to understand how all the tags work and how it's supposed to be structured, and looking through that. On top of it, we implemented DSRF to be from within the standard. We designed DSRF to easily be open and viewable and readable in Excel. So a non-technical partner or even non-technical business people within your teams can actually go and open up these files and take a quick look at it and largely get a good understanding of it. A great thing about switching to DSRF over XML is that it drastically reduces size. I'm sure we've already said this multiple times, but just looking through some of our data, I've noticed that in an XML file, you only can report roughly 450,000 resources within a 1 gigabyte file, whereas in comparison for a DSRF file that's 1 gigabyte, you can actually report closer to like 4 million resources in it. So you get about a 9x increase between the amount of data, and especially with the migration to more streaming platforms, especially on-demand streaming, where you have a larger number of transactions, this drastically reduces the size of files. Next slide. So some of the challenges that we've seen, getting it on the development roadmap. I'm sure this is something that mostly everyone can see or deal with. It's kind of a two-way street. If it's not broken, why fix it? There's times where we want to upgrade something, but partners aren't ready, or partners want us to upgrade it, but we don't have the available bandwidth within our current roadmap. So it's something that you'll have to kind of deal with. You'll probably most likely need to maintain different versions of the DSRF to be able to handle your reporting. But luckily, because it is a flat file, it is generally much easier, in my opinion, of dealing with the different variations of the versions. Another challenge is standards do move slower than the business. So you'll sometimes need to figure out ways of how to deal with this. One example that we had at Apple was when we launched Apple Music, DSRF was still in the process of being finished by the work group, but we had our reporting timelines that we need to meet that were actually going to be before DSRF was actually released. So because of that, we had to work on a method and work with all of our partners to come up with an intermittent method to report to them, which does create challenges, and I'm sure other people will have certain scenarios like that as well. Another area that is a challenge at times is translating the definitions of DDEX and the business requirements to your engineering team. The DDEX definitions may not always align with your business definitions. Mark kind of mentioned earlier that DDEX kind of defines the lingua franca of music business to an extent, and dealing with your engineers and in internal companies, you may have different definitions that don't align with DDEX, and therefore you have to kind of translate what the spec says into your own internal language. Additionally, there's the aspect of you have your own bilateral agreements and everything. DDEX gives you the standard of here's a spec to report your data in, but you also have to go through and determine everything that's in your agreements. For example, DDEX may define a field as optional because not every DSP or every licensor will be able to accept that information or have that information, but your bilateral agreements may say you need to report this information. So therefore you need to make sure that you take in all that information and kind of align it. And that is largely what I have.
Thanks, Chris, very much indeed. And thank you to all 4 companies for sharing your insights on implementation. So on the final stretch before Q&A, I will hand back to Niels. But if you have got questions, there's a slot at the end of this little section here. So start racking your brains for any questions, and we will obviously do what we can to respond once Niels has completed this section.
And this section won't be very long, so start typing your questions into the chat, please. And I'm going to repeat what we've said a couple of times. DSR and CDM are designed to work with one another. It's basically the same format, the same structure, the same terminology used, use types on both sides, it's the same. Commercial model types, it's the same. Territory, well, they're the same anyway. Down to the ability to, or the date format in both standards, it's exactly the same. So the technical framework is exactly the same. The object properties are the same. The file naming convention is not the same, but it's basically the same components that a file name has. It's a fairly long file name because it contains information about the sender, about the recipient, when it was done, what type of file is it. So is it a DSR file? Is it a CDM file? Is it a CDM correction? So when you correct the CDM file, or is it a notification of a discrepancy? So you make them up out of multiple components, but it's the same aspect. And CDM supports all of the DSR profiles, or at least all of the profiles that deal with works licensing. The CDM is not a process that deals with musical, with sound recordings. At the moment, there is nothing that DDEX has to report claims on sound recordings or the financial reckoning on sound recording claims. Both standards do multi-context and multi-category, as well as single context and single content category reporting and claiming. There is no difference in the capability on both sides. It's also possible, though, to say the DSR may be multi-context, but the reply, the DSR, the CDM, may then be single context. So there is a possibility, and that's something that, as Chris has said, licensee and licensor need to agree, and they need to come to an agreement. There is the possibility to have a space-saving DSR coming one way, but that the claims and the invoice details are then split out by different territories, which may very well be necessary on a business perspective. And different CDMs can be done on individual contexts, as I've just said, as long as those two parties agree. There's one thing that we have not mentioned at all, and that is something that we actually, when we looked at it while developing the CDM standard, we realized we were actually missing in the DSR standard. And therefore, well, that's one of the big benefits of actually both standards being worked on and maintained by the same bunch of people. We can add things to one standard if we realize while developing the other standard that the first standard is missing something. And that is the handling of what is sometimes called pre-usage sales and usage reports. Sounds a bit oxymoronic, but it does make sense in a moment. The standard way of dealing with sales and usage reports and claims for them is that a DSP who has received content from a record company or some kind of an aggregator, they start to make the content available, whether that's for streaming, whether that's downloading, whether it's UGC, whatever the business model may be. And once they have collected sales and usage information from their interactions with their consumers, they then send a DSR message to the works licensors, and in all likelihood to the licensors or the owners of the sound recordings as well. With respect to the works licensors, they will then receive those sales usage reports. They will then start to match things to their internal database. They will try to see what they own. They can then make claims and send those back to the DSP. But since they already know how often a specific sound recording and therefore a specific musical work has been used, they not only can make a claim, but they can also provide invoicing information. So that's the typical post-usage process. Based on those CDMs, you will then hopefully receive a check. The pre-usage process adds one critical step. This first step is the same. The DSP receives content from a record company and starts to make that available to consumers. But even before they have received sales and usage or collated sales and usage information, while maybe they're still in the first month of actually making that content available to consumers, they can send a sales and usage report without any sales and usage information to the musical works licensors. And they then can already start matching the stuff and making sure that they know what they own. And they can then provide back to the DSP claims for that material, for those musical works. There's still no usage information at all. It's only after the end of that sales and usage period that then a sales and usage report with sales and usage information with actual numbers in it can flow from the DSP to the works licensor, and the normal accounting process as described earlier happens. So the process is a little bit more complex because there's an extra step in it, but it does offer some benefits. And that is that the works licensor can actually do the matching process much earlier, thereby providing claims already to the DSP much earlier, which speeds up the whole process of claiming, and claims can be made much earlier than necessary in the other process. And it also gives the DSP an idea of who owns how much of each work before they come actually to making sales reports. This is what's called pre-usage. And in order to support that, we created the so-called master list profile, because that is now a DSR message that allows providing release, resource, and work information without any sales and usage information, because it's not known at that stage. I think that summarizes the integration of those two standards, again, to emphasize, it's basically, you can see that as one standard, one choreography. They work very closely with one another. And they're ready to be implemented, and are implemented indeed.
Thank you, Niels, and thank you to all our presenters. In the last few minutes that's left, if any of the people who are registered for the webinar who are on would like to ask any questions, we will do our best to answer those. If you think of them as soon as you come off the webinar, which is probably more likely, please don't hesitate to send an email to info@ddex.net. That comes to myself and Niels, and we will, of course, do our best to answer any questions that you may have. But in the absence, here we go. So we do have one question here. Many licensors provide CCID response to master list DSR. Any thoughts from the floor on how and when the transition to CDM from CCID will happen? That's a good question. That really needs the licensees and licensors to respond. I appreciate you can't commit to anything, but a general introduction as to how you see that moving forward would be helpful.
I can jump in on from Apple's perspective. So I know we've kind of had to push back CDM on our roadmap because we obviously have other products and things like that that we've been working on. But I believe in early 2021 is our plan to begin implementing CDM. And then, of course, there's going to be the time frame of trying to get licensors to migrate over. There's still kind of the open question of will we be able to deal with mixed CDM, CCID, or will we try to get everyone to move over at the same time? So it's a bit hard to give an exact timeline, but by I'd say the end of 2021, early 2022 is when we'd like to be migrating over to CDM.
Thanks, Chris. Spotify, are you able to comment on that at the moment, or is it still a little bit too far away?
Well, both. We can comment that it's too far away.
Okay.
No, I will kind of echo what Chris said. Well, we have also had to kind of push that back a bit further down the line. As you've heard, we are now really rolling out DSRF in the next year. So that's kind of a first step, I would say. So we won't be working on CDM in 2021, to be clear. And we'll start going back there in 2022. So that's really high level.
Sure.
We'll obviously need some more discovery, etc. before. So
yeah.
But that's what I can do.
No, that's entirely fair enough. And any of the licensors able to give an indication of planning on that front?
Maybe one word on that. In Europe, there are many discussions at the time being in the context of the steering committee for 2G and 2G about CDM and implementation.
Laurent, could you just explain what TOGI is? I don't think everybody will know what that is.
Yeah, of course. TOGI is a technical online working group for Europe. So it's a group of, let's say, almost all licensors in Europe, and especially all licensors in Europe who license on a pan-European basis. So we have regular discussions, of course, on technical aspects, and in order to manage different technical aspects, typically the implementation of such formats, such standards, as very often there is a need of consistency between the exchange that is done between licensors and one licensee. So we had these discussions at the time being, and so I cannot provide any date. We don't have any official date at the time being, but we are on it, and with an objective to get it implemented. Should be, let's say, I think in the spirit of what Chris and Magali said, by end of 21, early 22, by that time.
Okay, thank you. So there was a specific question aimed at Apple and CDM, but I think you got the answer from what Chris said. If there are no other questions, then I would like to. Oh, there is one. Oh, no, so thank you.
It's not a question.
So I'd like to thank you for attending. Again, to thank our colleagues at BMAT, SACEM, Spotify, PRS, David, I keep calling you PRS, I know that's not right, iServices and Apple for participating and providing their insights. I hope you've found the webinar helpful. And I would remind you that next week we will be doing another webinar which will be much more focused on the CDM standard. And I think the one that's taking place at the same time as this has is on Thursday next week. And hopefully you will be able to join that. So thank you all very much for attending and have a good rest of your day wherever you are. Thank you very much.